Departamento de Ciências da Comunicação, FCSH, UNL.
And his presentation is entitled Progress, Stagnation and Repetition in Philosophy and Drama.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm anxious about the book for different reasons. In the book that, as was mentioned on philosophy and theatre that's about to come out, I'm really, I suppose, talking about what philosophers have said about theatre. And when I wrote that, plenty of things were left out that I would have liked to have included in an ideal world. Because as I was going through the various remarks that philosophers have made when talking specifically about theatre, their philosophical theories of theatre, if you like, there were all sorts of references to theatre which came up, which weren't theorising theatre, but showed perhaps how philosophers have thought about it. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. But first, by way of an introduction, I want to talk about a play instead. So, those of us who are interested in philosophy and theatre probably know that when philosophers get portrayed on the stage, it isn't always terribly kindly. It's not always a good thing to be a philosopher in a play. And indeed, some have gone so far as to attempt to identify a stock comic character that is the stage philosopher. And I'm sure you can come up with your own examples, starting, of course, with Socrates in Aristophanes. Now, there are all sorts of characters in Chekhov's plays who might count as the on-stage comic philosopher. But in Three Sisters, which is the play I want to start with, it's not a philosopher at all. It's probably a soldier, namely the major, the lovesick major, they call him, who, whatever else is true of him, has a terrible habit of philosophizing. When he does so, when he does his philosophizing, and there's nothing particularly unusual about this, it tends not to be presented as philosophizing for philosophizing's sake. It tends to be presented instead as a sort of slightly more benign kind of after-dinner entertainment compared to something like playing cards or drinking. If you recall the play, drinking and playing cards do a lot more damage than philosophy does. Philosophy is relatively harmless. So that, in as much as is a tradition, goes back happily to the symposium. You'll remember that the philosophy done in the symposium is also a kind of after-dinner activity, an alternative to bringing in the flute girls, or the oboe girls, if you want to call them by their accurate name. So, as in the symposium, philosophy is presented as a kind of pleasant after-dinner activity, though as in the symposium, I don't think that necessarily means we should ignore the content of the philosophizing. And in the case of Chekhov's play, the content of the philosophizing, as it so often is in his plays, is about whether human beings can make progress. This is the lovesick major's chosen refrain, if you remember. It's the refrain about whether in 200 or 300, or occasionally 1,000 years, human beings will have got anywhere or not. His counterpart in these discussions, Tusenbach, says no, and the lovesick major says yes. I'll give you a couple of these examples just by way of quotations, but I can't dwell on them respecting the time constraints. Here is the lovesick major, for example. In 200 or 300 years, life on Earth will be unimaginably beautiful, marvellous. Man needs such a life, and though he hasn't got it yet, he must have a presentiment of it, expect it, dream it, prepare for it. For he must see and know more than his father and grandfather. And then here is the response. When we are dead, men will fly in balloons, change the fashion of their coats, will discover a sixth sense, all of those have more or less happened, incidentally, perhaps, and develop sixth sense, but life will remain just the same, difficult, full of mysteries, and happiness In 1,000 years, man will sigh just the same, oh, how hard life is. That certainly seems to be the case. And yet, just as now, he will be afraid of death and not want it. So far, so good for both of them. Now, in as much as they're answering a philosophical question, it's one that's not heard very much among contemporary philosophers, but it is one with a long tradition. And indeed, parts of Kant's essay on universal history could have wandered in, barring some of the Germanic flourishes, could have happily wandered into a conversation in the Three Sisters. Here is Kant. It remains strange that the earlier generations appear to carry through their toilsome labour only for the sake of the later, to prepare for them a foundation on which the later generations could erect the higher edifice which was nature's goal, and yet that only the latest of the generations should have the good fortune to inhabit the building on which a long line of their ancestors had unintentionally laboured without being permitted to partake of the fortune they had prepared. And my experience reading out long Kant quotations isn't conducive to people understanding necessarily what he's saying. So forgive me if I summarise it for a moment. I mean, the lovesick major is saying, isn't it wonderful that we get to work towards something, because then human beings, after we're dead, will finally be happy. And Kant is saying, well, even if that's true, it's not very nice for the people who are working towards it, which seems just kind of unfair or inappropriate. And with that, we're heading more towards what the interest of my project is, of which I'm only presenting a tiny part today. That is to say, a side project spinning out of the book, not part of the book itself. And that is that what I want to suggest is that when philosophers write about this question of whether we're going anywhere, are we making progress or not, the images they use, to an extent that is to me worth commenting on, the images they use are theatrical images. It's the theatre that seems to come up. So whereas Chekhov is having philosophers on stage thinking about progress, what I'm suggesting is that when real philosophers, as it were, do it, they tend to think about it using the stage. Kant's essay, indeed, famously begins with him contemplating with potential disgust what he calls the world's stage. That's what he's looking at when he makes these remarks. It would be like a theatre, it would be like a play, if it weren't the case. And indeed, you might think that the theatre is a particularly good example of what Kant is looking for, at least up to a point, in that it presents to him a bunch of people acting in their own often deluded interest, often with partial understanding, and often in unpleasant or immoral ways. That's all the characters, of course. But really, as a result of an overarching plan for the sake of something better, namely the performance, the plan according to the playwright, and so on. Or as Kant puts it, a history with a definite natural plan for creatures with no plan of their own. Now, one can't take this comparison too far, of course, and Kant doesn't, because the plan is supposed to be natural, in his sense, not awful. So as I say, as philosophical questions go, I don't think this is a bad one, though I have to confess I've not heard many contemporary philosophers trying to answer it. And what I want to suggest, though I'm not really going to be able to back this up in today's context, is that it might be helpful to divide the philosophers who answer this question into three very broad categories, always with the flag, if you like, that probably no good philosopher will fall neatly into any one of them. But what I want to call the philosophers of progress, the philosophers of stagnation, and the philosophers of repetition, where progress and stagnation, I take it obvious. The progress ones are ones like the major in some sense. The stagnation ones are like his opponent. I read quotes from both of them. And repetition forms a peculiar third category, which is trying to be neither, but I won't be able to pursue today. So, for philosophers of stagnation, the basic or significant facts about human beings are liable to stay the same whatever it is that we do, whereas for philosophers of progress, that's not the case. Of course, a philosopher of progress could also be a negative philosopher of progress. It could be somebody who thought that things are getting worse, not things are getting better. Alright, now as I say, what I'm suggesting is, when you look at philosophers, particularly in the century leading up to Three Sisters, if you look at what philosophers are doing when they answer that question, it's the stage that seems to come up in a prominent way as they think it through. And in what remains, basically, I'll have an opportunity to look very briefly at one such philosopher, and I'll have to ask you to imagine, to extrapolate to one or two others. But there we are. And the philosopher I want to concentrate on is a philosopher of stagnation very much, and that's Schopenhauer. Now, if asked the lovesick major's question, anybody who's read Schopenhauer will surely agree that his answer would fall more or less along the lines of no, in 200 to 300 years, we won't have made any progress. In 200 to 300 years, we won't look back and think what wonderful things we did, except possibly in a narrow and very specific sense that we've advanced philosophically. But advancing philosophically, he's very clear about this, doesn't actually change the basic facts about human beings. And so as far as Schopenhauer is concerned, as long as there are human beings, we'll always be in the same suffering condition, not very much unlike the one described in the Three Sisters. And he also, incidentally, has an argument to the effect that human beings can't die out. One of a number of mistakes when you look back on it with hindsight, but he wasn't alone. So no major work can be undertaken, he thinks, no universal project or process of reason could possibly change our basic scenario. Anyone who's read Schopenhauer will know that one could pick at random almost any page of his writing for a quotation to this effect, especially his writings on morals and partly in his writings on aesthetics, but I'll just give you my favourite one. Here he is. It is really incredible how meaningless and insignificant when seen from without, and how dull and senseless when felt from within, is the course of life of the great majority of men. If you're wondering what happens to not the great majority of men, we'll come to that in a moment. It's not that great. It is weary longing, that is the course of life for the great majority of men. It is weary longing and worrying, a dream like staggering through the 4 ages of life to death, accompanied by a series of trivial thoughts. There we are. Wonderful stuff. And magnificently compelling. So, the reasons for this misery, and I'll just summarise a couple of Schopenhauer's basic thoughts. Forgive me if you know these already, but I need them before I go on to some of the stuff that perhaps won't be so common knowledge. In this retelling of the cave myth, the philosopher or genius is no longer the one who stops watching the drama, right? It's not the person who's watching, glued to the drama and then leaves it. It's the person who starts watching the drama, because everyone else is in it. That's the point. Okay. There are a couple of other points which I'm unfortunately not going to have time to go through. I will mention them, I will label them, rather than talking about them explicitly, if that's okay. One is, this has particular relevance to Schopenhauer's view about love, or really about sex and reproduction, actually, because he describes that in terms of creating the characters for the next scene, and there's a reason why he's talking about it. Another thing it explains is why Schopenhauer thinks he can help himself to the content of plays, as long as the plays are written by geniuses, to explain, as it were, human anthropological facts. I mean, it's a striking thing about Schopenhauer that he'll say, this is proved by this happening in Hamlet. And we don't really do that anymore. But it's not just that he does it because he kind of thinks he can. He's got a particular view about why it is that someone like Shakespeare had a better understanding of the world than an everyday person would. Okay, so I've suggested, and that's all I really can do in time, that it might be interesting to look at how philosophers respond to our lovesick nature. That's the question of whether we can make progress. Noting that many of them seem to do so using the notion of theatre as a figure, or as in Schopenhauer's case, and very often elsewhere, something more than that, so something that's integrated into their view about aesthetics than something broader. In Schopenhauer's case, the answer clearly falls on the side of stagnation. And what I'm suggesting, again, just a final summary, is it's an aesthetic theory. It's an aesthetic theory which is an answer to this question. It's an aesthetic theory which is an answer to this question, which is using images from aesthetics itself. So, there we are.